Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today's session will dive into all the aspects of a data breach most organizations tend not to think about until it's too late. In this Anatomy of a Data Breach session today, two seasoned experts, David White and Brian Lapidus, will share practical insights from the front line and how to protect your clients and your brand. Before we get started, though, a couple housekeeping items. We're using GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you'll find their client floating somewhere in your monitor. We'd like to invite you to submit questions through that client, and our presenters and moderators will try to address as many questions as possible. We'll follow up with those that we can't answer in today's session. You'll also find on that client a handout section where you can download relevant materials, and we hope you'll find them helpful. Please keep in mind today's presentation was carefully researched, but do not represent legal advice. We are recording the session, and everyone that registered will receive a link to the recording along with the presentation that you see today in a few days. With that, I turn to Brian to kick us off.
Thank you, Leo. We're really thrilled for you to join David and I today to discuss some of the trends around the world as it relates to data breaches. So our style, for those of you who have worked with either one of us or known us in the past, is very conversational. And so feel free in the chat window to ask questions. We're going to focus our time today really thinking and focusing around how these data breaches occur and how you work with them and deal with the repercussions internationally. There have been a lot of these sessions in North America. So really we want to make today have we'll call it a greater international flair, and that'll be apparent with my Southern accent from Tennessee and David's from the UK. So as Leo introduced us, real quick, I'm Brian Lapidus. I am based in Nashville. I've been with Kroll for about 18 years, and I've been involved with helping our clients manage data breaches since the first legislation passed in California, which was the first data breach notification sort of privacy legislation globally. So the gray hair you can see on my head comes from helping those clients over the last 18 years deal with crises. David's gray hair is completely tied to me. With that, Mr. White.
Thanks, Brian. As Brian said, my name is David, and I've been at Kroll now for just under 4 years. I started off my career actually in the military, jumped across to intelligence services, did a stint within an investment bank, and then came across to Kroll. And I think one of the things that sort of underpins most of my career is that sort of crisis management, which I've been sort of lucky enough to still play in that space within Kroll. So looking at what we want to cover today, what we want to talk about really is data breaches. You know, what are they and what are they about? What do they look like? What do they smell like? We want you to be able to sort of walk away from today with having a bit of an idea about how you might plan for such an event, what you can do, what are the things that you might want to think about. I think from my perspective, one of the things that I've learned in the last 4 years is that every single breach is different, whether it's from the entity that's had the incident versus the data that's impacted, or even the consumer base that might also be impacted there. And then how does geography play here? I mean, there's some obvious examples where geography can make things more complex. The fact that you have time zones involved, languages. You know, recently we had to send some letters out to Kyrgyzstan, and you know, for a lot of people, they were trying to in the office. We had to sort of work out, you know, where is it? Is it a real country? What's the sort of what's the mailing sort of situation like out there? Because I think a lot of people hadn't heard of that particular country. And then, you know, lastly, we can't sort of do anything like this without talking about COVID and sort of understanding about what impact that has had on our part of the business. So what parts are still running as normal and which bits are either taking a bit longer or are a bit more challenging. So looking at, nobody can escape the headlines. And I think lots of people will have seen these over the last couple of years. I think for those of us that sit within the UK, we will have seen more over the last couple of years because of some of the changing and new privacy regulations that have come in. But whenever a large company has been impacted with a data breach, or there's some significant numbers there, it will hit the headlines. And I think more recently we've seen some pretty big fine numbers being thrown around as potential fines for these organizations. But I think one of the things that this shows us is there's a load of noise happening here. From your normal stakeholders through to from the media, angry customers, how are they playing in this space? Is there any statements that are being taken out of context? And social media, I mean, another one that you can have a huge impact by a relatively small amount of people there.
So when we look at when we get pulled in, you can imagine the questions that we get, and one of the questions we get a lot are, what what questions do you get from your clients? They're in crisis. What do you see? So, as we were kind of preparing for today, we thought through what are some of the big things that people ask us when we get pulled in. So, number one, if we notify, are we accepting responsibility or liability for the breach? Next, what have you done for international clients to help them respond? This is a mature concept in other countries. In the US, how do we deal with this in other markets? Next, how do I deal with different country or state regulators, right? As Leo said at the very beginning, we are not attorneys, and so we work with our legal partners in all markets. But this concept of dealing with regulators with different expectations from a privacy perspective is often upfront. What do you need to be mindful as a part of response? How do you take into account cultural nuances in different countries around this requirement? What is the potential impact of doing nothing? I think that may be my favorite question, because you really start to understand the psyche of an organization and where their mindset is when that question comes up. And lastly, how am I supposed to pay for this? The cyber liability insurance space covers parts of these events and doesn't cover other parts of these events. And so, while the organization may have a policy, they may not know the details of that policy. And so these questions, I would say, are our top 6 of what we hear most often. So I think this quote sums it up and really talks about the shift around the world as it relates to privacy. So by 2023, we're going to see 65% of the world's population with some personal data covered under privacy regulations. In 2020, just last year, that was only 10%. And so what does this mean in actuality? And I think here's the big takeaway for me. Over the course of 3 years, there's going to be a 50, organizations are going to have to notify either regulators or their customers when they breach someone's privacy, when they breach an organization's privacy, when they breach a consumer's privacy. They are all of a sudden going to have responsibilities that they did not have 5 years ago. And making sure that they can manage that, handle it, and act against it is really going to be a game changer for businesses and companies around the world. So, again, in that vein of the new 65% by the end of 2023, this map shows shows in the dark teal where there already is legislation, in the light teal where there's pending legislation, in the orange where there's not legislation. And so when you look at that, you can see how much of the world is now covered and focusing on data protection and privacy as normal course of business, which just isn't, it's a newer phenomenon and something that organizations now have to worry about. In 2020, a third of our breaches that we handled were covered, had at least 2 or more countries impacted. And as an organization, you are no longer your customers. There's no such thing as local. in a lot of cases anymore. Your customers are around the world in lots of different ways. I think best described by some of the shopping that went on in my house during COVID. I received packages from from retailers around the world that someone in my family had ordered. Um, you know, and they came from China. It came from the UK. You know, those organizations now had customers in the US. So different mindset, different way organizations need to think about who their customer bases are.
Thanks, Brian. So looking at some of the trends that we've seen over the couple of years, there'll be some areas here that won't really surprise you. So looking at things like healthcare, both in terms of the number of cases, but also the average cost of having to support a breach, they are up there. Whilst certain countries will have very stringent or more stringent healthcare privacy regulations, I think there's a common factor here. The data that is held by healthcare organizations can be everything from fairly benign through to the most sensitive data available in that industry. And I think if any of that data is made public, there are huge and very significant and damaging effects of that. Finance as well. I think for a lot of people, they initially go to, well, is credit card data or bank data impacted here? But I think it goes a little bit further than that, because if you think about the type of the amount of data that a finance company will have on you, yes, they've got your name, date of birth, and address, but they've also got, how many loans have you got? Have you got car finance? Were you rejected for some finance? And I think when you start to put all that information together, actually you can do a lot of damage to an actual individual with regards to identity theft, because you can start to answer some of those financial questions on their behalf. And then technology, it won't have escaped everybody, but the amount of data that technology is capturing these days is huge. And I think as they capture that data and they're able to aggregate that data together, that then creates a very, very powerful amount of information that they have, both at the aggregated level, but also on specific individuals as well. So I think understanding some of those trends is very important. So when it comes to breaches, when we talk with clients, especially let's say before an event has happened, and if somebody wants to know what can they do about it, I think a lot of clients always go to worst case scenario. So what's a mega breach? And if they've got 10 million potential clients, what happens if we lose 10 million persons' data? Now, absolutely, that is something to worry about. And mark my words, when a mega breach happens, they're painful. They absolutely are. But I think this is a really good case of most likely versus worst case scenario in terms of breaches. And you can see by this this graphic here is we see more breaches in the lower tiers. That is what we see. We still see larger breaches, and they absolutely happen. But I think this is important to think about, because when we talk with our forensic peers, they will often say to us, well, initially a breach may have thought it was 1 million people, but actually after some forensics analysis, that number has come down, and quite often it's not the whole data set that's been impacted. So therefore, just understanding and having a process for a smaller breach is important. And I think the other thing to just consider, even with the smaller breaches, is size may not matter here. It really could be the complexity. It could be the type of data that's been impacted. It could be the number of countries where those individuals are located. And what you'll also find within the organization, even for smaller breaches, the number of people, the types of people that are involved are still the same compared to what we call a mega breach. So we've got a couple of numbers here. I think the takeaway things from here are the number of breaches that are being reported are still increasing. And you can see here that over nearly 120,000 breaches in the EU were reported last year. And the number of fines are also going up. I think that will continue to go up as we as more and more, as Brian was saying, more and more regulations come out, and they're attributing potential fines to those regulations. But I think the fines are only part of the story, and I think there's a number of other implications that a client needs to sort of think about in regards to a data breach, and we'll come on to some of them. Come on to some of them later. So we've actually got a poll, and we'd like just to ask a question. So within your organisation that you're part of, what part of your organisation spans just one country or multiple countries? And that could be internally your organisation, your legal entity structure, your client based. If you could let us know, that'd be great.
I feel like we're watching a game show.
I know. So for those people that have never given a webinar before, we can see a number of statistics sort of coming in. So Leo, I think if you can just show the results there for us, that would be great. So we've got 84% of the audience have said multiple countries, and I'll be honest, that's not surprising from what we're seeing at the moment. You know, the number of events that we've seen involving multiple countries now has been increasing for the last couple of years. Leo, you can pull that now, thank you. And I think if we ask this question next year, I think that number would continue to go up. So who is involved when it comes to a data breach? Who are the players that you're likely to encounter? Internally within your organization, as I said before, all breaches are different, and the types of people and the types of departments that are involved changes, and it's really interesting to see how different organizations deal with it. Counsel will usually be involved in some way, shape or form, whether that's internal counsel or whether it's external. One other thing that can also complicate matters, and we've seen this for sort of more larger multi-jurisdictional events, is you may have multiple counsels. So we've had it before where the US has used one counsel, one legal firm, and EMEA and APAC have used another one. So that can just create a little more complexity about how we deal with that. And then having a breach response partner. So like Kroll, who are the partners, who are the vendors that you can use to support you on your response? Have you got contracts with them in place? Do you know how they work? Do you know how they require data? And as Brian said, who's going to pay for it? So the insurance carrier, a lot of our clients now find that they have insurance in some way, shape or form. So where does the insurance play? Can they pay for all of the breach, or is it just part of it? And I think lastly, but definitely not least, is the consumers, the data subjects here. I always think of this as, you know, forget this group at your peril, because these are the people that will have a real impact to them as a result of a potential breach. And I think those companies that have operated best and had a really good response are the ones that constantly go back and ask the question, okay, how does this affect our consumers? What can we do for our consumers? Is this the right approach for them?
So looking at this, I wanted to kind of give an insight. My hope is that on the call, none of you have had to go through this. However, sort of given current statistics, I would imagine some of you have. And so when we think about the schedule and the stakeholders, wanted to talk about what to expect when you're not expecting a breach. So the first piece and the first recommendation is make sure you run a proper investigation. You have to understand what happened to truly mitigate the risk around it. So, you know, I can tell you that when clients come to us and say, hey, we need your help in notifying. We always go back to the beginning to say, do you know what happened? And here's why. We've had clients who have notified and then tried to figure out what happened, and they've wasted a ton of money because they did not have a notifiable event. They actually did not have an exposure. And so using forensics and understanding what happened is really, really important. From a stakeholder perspective, you want to make sure that you have all of your key stakeholders, your leadership involved. And here's why. I know a lot of organizations say, I want to keep the C-suite out of this. I need to keep them apprised, but you would be surprised at the level of involvement um, that 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 a C-suite wants to have in this, especially as it relates to the communication. So an example that I will give you is a case that we were working, and there was a executive team in the US and there was an executive team in the UK, and and the team did a great job getting everything teed up. We were ready to go. We were notifying a large group of people. We had call centers trained. Everything was ready to go. And in the 11th hour, someone on there was a I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a politically correct way. There was sort of a duel, a political duel between the two organizations on either side of the pond. And what that did was there was a debate over the letters, over the content, and they had to change a lot of things in the 11th hour, which cost them a lot of money. And so making sure you have all the right stakeholders, in this case, it was the leadership, engaged globally is really, really important. Next, from a pre-announcement perspective, you have to understand where your data is and know what your data is. And so part of our process is to help make sure that you have a one-to-one ratio of your communication. If I'm letting David know that his data was compromised, I'm letting David know once. That's beneficial from a cost perspective, but it also is beneficial from a credibility perspective. We've had, from a process perspective, we do a lot of data cleanses, a lot of data cleansing and a lot of data deduplication. But sometimes clients are adamant about not. Um, hey, David, would you go back a slide, please? Perfect. Um, so we've had some from a notification from a data perspective. Sorry, um, clients who just go through and say our data is pristine, and all of a sudden a consumer gets 30, 50 letters in the mail saying the exact same thing because they don't know what their data is. From a response perspective, monitoring social media. Um, you have a message as an organization, you're going out there, you're communicating with the public, but other people can hijack that message. And being aware of what people are saying in the regular media, but what we've seen in more recent times is social media can change. It can take on a life of its own. So handling an event for a university, alumni were very, very upset about this event. They didn't like the way they were spoken to, and so they took the event which in a whole different direction, and were bombarding the university via social media, Twitter, Facebook. And they were doing this, and it changed the approach of the organization. The organization depends on its alumni, and they did not get ahead of that group as a stakeholder. So understanding and monitoring these changes that happen in real time, and it occurs over about 90 days once that event happens, is really, really important. Finally, as it relates to this, um, after the event, the most common mistake is not planning for the future. Making sure that your board, your GC, your leadership team understands that this is probably going to happen again. What do you do differently next time? This is you've done it once. There are going to always be things you can do different or better. Not taking that opportunity is a mistake. Next slide, please, Dave. So when we look at this, I love this sort of graphic because all of these outside forces are impacting your organization in some form or fashion when this happens. And rather than focus on the individual boxes, I want to think about the impact. So financial impact. When you have one of these events, you have the costs to mitigate it, You have the cost for compensating affected consumers or individuals that were impacted um, by your privacy event. You have regulatory penalties and fines tied to it. You have an impact if you're publicly traded, your share price. All of these things, all these outside forces are impacting your financial impact. You have reputational damage from an organizational perspective. You know, the length of that organizational reputational damage is dependent on how you handle this event. So we have seen organizations that come out of these events, um, actually have built stronger relationships with their customers because of how they've handled it. So it's possible to make this a win between you and your organization, you and your stakeholders and your customers, as opposed to a loss. Now, it takes effort and it takes a real focus to make that happen, but it's important. You have your operational impact. When these events happen, it impacts how you do business, right? It impacts your day. Unfortunately, we had a healthcare client, a hospital, and they were in a situation where the public found out about the event before they were ready and before anybody knew. So what were consumers doing? What were patients doing? They were calling the hospital. Nurses, doctors, administrators at the hospital are not trained to take calls from angry consumers who want to know why their diagnosis information has been made public. So those people whose day job is to take care of patients were unable to do that. So your operational impact when these events happen are really, really important. Lastly, to touch on legal action. Litigation is a part of this, be it from stakeholders, be it from third parties, be it from consumers. Managing that increase in litigation that comes from these events from a cost and a service delivery perspective, and a psyche of the organization, when you have 30 class action lawsuits facing you in addition to your normal course of business, again, is a challenge that you as a business need to be mindful of. So taking into account all of these blue boxes, all have implications to a data breach and impact your organization in multiple ways that you have to be mindful of when you're dealing with it.
So what the challenge, how does a client who's facing a breach deal with this? And we see this all the time. Your clients have to make some really, really tough decisions, and each of those decisions will generally have an impact. And I've broken this area down into really four parts here. Speed. Brian's already touched on this, but if you try and operate too quickly, the chances are there will be something that will go wrong. Either you will potentially, it will cost you more because you'll be notifying a population you may not need to, or you may just get things wrong. But speed is really important because I think for a couple of jurisdictions out there, they have regulatory requirements, and where either the entity has to report this to the regulator and or to the consumers as well. And those dates are generally fixed. And so, for some of them, they can be 60 days. So that first 30 days can feel like quite a long time. And then actually, as you start getting closer to that, it starts to become really, really critical. But the other thing about speed is, what do you need to do internally? I think there'll be a number, I'm going to ask a question about how long does it take things to be signed off internally? And I think I can imagine there's an awful lot of people smiling to themselves thinking, gosh, these things can take a long time. So having a plan about who signs things off, how quickly can they be signed off, especially if things have to change. Things like branding. Also, how quickly do you need to set things up? So Brian just spoke about organizations that had to do something much quicker than they thought. They had to set up a call center so they could direct the calls away from a hospital. How quickly can that be done? And then how you then potentially add more capability to that in the time of need is also really, really important, and something that needs to be considered. So scale of this, I think for a lot of people, when they think scale, they think, okay, this has got to be big. But I think for even with relatively small breaches, if you're having to use resources that will impact your day-to-day resources, then you need to know how you're going to scale that up. And so, a good example is, let's say you decide you have to send some letters out or more emails out to your consumers, you might have that capability. But if you utilize that in-house capability, what effect will that have on your day-to-day ability there? And how can you scale for numbers? And what we see with a lot of clients is they will say to us, hey, well, we've got a call center capability. Can we use that? And we say, absolutely, yes, we can. But what we will find is usually there will be a period of time where they need to scale for a period of time. So how do we get there in terms of the scale? So complexity is a massive one here. And I think when we asked the first poll about multiple countries, this is a really good example. When you start looking at different jurisdictions, you have time zones, you have languages that all come to play here. Now, some of the times you may decide actually that it's a small group of people in a particular country. We can't actually utilize language capabilities for every single country. And then it comes on to things like priority. So we've worked with clients before. One that had a breach of tens of millions of people. And what they did, which was really helpful from our perspective, was they actually broke down the client side of things into priorities. So they had their priority one of their most important clients, or the clients that had most amount of sort of contact with them over 6 months, and then they moved down. And I think that side of things can really help and can start to sort of unpick some of the complexity that we have there. And then as we look across the world, the services that we can provide there aren't always the same. So absolutely, we can send letters to anywhere in the world. We can set up a call center so people can call up. But there's other services that sometimes are offered here. So it might be identity monitoring, it could be credit monitoring. Those services are not offered in every single country around the world. So understanding about what is on offer in which country and how you're going to deal with that is also key here. And then you've got your business as usual. As I've already said, there's a breach might have taken a company out for a period of time. It may have disabled a website that is needed for whether it's online purchasing or whether it's needed for some other reason. And I think understanding about how a company can get back to their business as usual as quick as possible, and leveraging other resources or vendors to allow them the response to be handled correctly, so that the business as usual can continue and not impact there. And we see this a lot around the November, December time. We have clients where it's the most important time of the year for them from a sales perspective, and they don't want anything at all to be impacting things like their own call centers, so that they want somebody else to be doing that on their behalf. And geography is a really important one. From our perspective, we tend to base ourselves out of three locations, but having the ability to be able to service your clients across the globe is really important. And the languages can be really key here. We've worked with clients before where they've chosen to support a breach in let's call it 5 languages, only to be told a couple of weeks later by a particular regulator that they must put in a call center with individuals that can speak that specific language. Otherwise, they're going to be in further trouble with a regulator. Brian, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, David. So, Leo, if you could open the next poll. This is our next poll question, and we had about 65% of you answer last time, so let's shoot to get it a little higher this time. Question here is, do you have vendors and legal partners selected with existing signed contracts in place should you have a data breach? All right, so we're at about 50%. All right, we're going to go ahead and close it. So let's go ahead and show the results, if you will. So that's, I will tell you, having done this for a while, this is a great response. 76% of you have contracts and plans in place, which is fantastic. I will say, negotiating in the 11th hour to make sure you have the right providers in place, it's not a fun exercise on either side of the equation. And so the fact that so many of you have these is fantastic. So, the concept around breach notification, it's art and it's science. And so trying to synthesize it down to some clear, clean takeaways that you can have, from our perspective, it comes down to really these four things. You want to match your remedy to risk. So if as an organization you lose just the client's name, do you have requirements to notify in some markets? Absolutely. Um, if you lose their name, their social insurance number, medical prescription history, medical diagnosis, that's a different ballgame. It's a different ballgame. And so understanding the risk that you're causing based on the data that's been compromised is really important. And providing, a remedy, be it credit monitoring or dark web monitoring or some sort of solution that matches that need is very, very important. Next, avoid the blame game. So, it's a little funny. I sometimes feel like I'm, talking to, I guess, my kids. You've got to apologize, and you can't blame your sister or you can't blame your brother. There's something about being accountable. If you had the data, but you gave it to a third party, your customers, your clients, your employees aren't going to look to that third party. They're looking at you. And so, we have found that owning it is far better than deflecting and blaming someone else. As it relates to communication, be thoughtful and clear. Understand what you're saying. Make sure you're stating the facts. Again, going back to that chart earlier around sort of the investigation aspect of it, it doesn't instill confidence to say one thing and then change it 3 weeks later. So the more you know up front allows you and enables you to be more thoughtful and clear when it's time to communicate. And because you know what's happened, you have a plan and you're working against your plan and you're sharing that information with the public. Next and last, apologize. I really don't think there's an expectation of perfection. Customers, partners, vendors, they may be annoyed, but they don't expect perfection. Empathy goes a long, long way in making this happen, making it go away. So that apology and making sure it's sincere is important. So I don't think we can talk about anything anymore without talking about the impact of the current global pandemic. So data breach in the time of COVID. The graphic on the right came from IBM, just to sort of source it correctly. But this survey talked about an increased time to identify or contain a data breach. 76%, it would impact the ability to respond to a data breach by 76%. And we have found this from our experience from March until current. So what are the big takeaways here? And what are some of the possible workarounds for it? So number one, it's not simple to work when you're not all in a room together. And we have created virtual rooms, virtual war rooms with our clients, but it's not the same as being together working through a crisis. The concept of dealing with things virtually, especially globally, time zones are difficult. Anyway, dealing with that globally, where while people are working at home with multiple distractions coming out at them, are really, really, it impacts your ability to go quickly. I think the last thing two things. Number one, the law is the law, and the timetables are the timetables, and they're non-negotiable. There's not an asterisk next to the timeline requirements, the regulatory requirements for notification, and so is there sensitivity around it? Is there, is there some flexibility? Likely, yes, but the timelines are important and they're not negotiable upfront. And so making sure that you are acting quickly and demonstrating that speed is important. I think the last point I want to touch on for this one is around making sure that we are instilling customer confidence. Is hard to do with distractions. So if you think about all of the inbound information we're getting right now between vaccines, vaccine schedules, schools being in session or not being in session, finding ways to cut through the noise and make sure that the customer understands that there's been an event, and if there's action you need them to take, you got to find a way to be creative and make sure that they're seeing it in the confines of all the other data that's coming at them. And I think that's challenging enough in the 21st century, but you put COVID on top of it and it's even harder. So those are things to really be mindful of from a COVID perspective. So thrilled that 76% of you are ready with vendors in place. Now, these are some things that we want you to think about to do to prepare. Number one, know where your customer data is. Know where any PII you have, know where that is and how you can retrieve it quickly. Make sure you know who your stakeholders are. Um, when this happens, know that you want them at the ready, and I want you to contingency plan for those stakeholders. One of the things that we do when we talk with our clients before an event is, and we do tabletop exercises, is we want to make sure that they know who their main stakeholders are, and then once they go through and we role play and we go through that scenario, we pick a person in the room and we say, okay, you are out of it. You're on a cruise for 2 weeks and you're unavailable. So we mix up. You got to have a contingency plan. What if someone's not here? What if someone's on vacation? What if someone has a family emergency? That happens, and it adds insult to injury to the process if you haven't done the proper contingency planning for it. So those, I would say, those as well as making sure that your vendors are on place are the key points to make sure you do now before an event happens.
Thanks, Brian. And I think as we sort of start to bring this to a close and to some questions, I think, and I make no apologies for this, this is for those of you that may have a slight military background, this is something that gets drummed into us when we go through military training, but, have a plan, make sure you have your partners that are ready, practice that plan, where if something happens, execute against the plan that you've put in place. A number of times we've seen people where, we're helping clients, they're doing things. We said, oh, why are you doing it that way? And they said, oh, but yeah, we've got a plan. It says something else, but we thought it'd be better this way. There's a reason why we execute against plans. And then be prepared to pivot and change. There are always curveballs thrown in, okay? And those curveballs can be, and we've given some examples about whether they're internal within your organization, whether they're from a regulator or whether they're from a consumer or a client, but they will generally have one. And as the saying goes, no battle survives first contact with the enemy.
All right, so we have a couple questions in the chat, Brian and David. I will start at the top. So one of the questions we came in was around cyber insurance. So it says, during a data breach response, what's the role of cyber insurance? How do they help, in parentheses, if they do?
So I'm happy to take this one. So the answer is yes, they do help. I think it depends on, and it's such the cliche with insurance, it depends on the policy. But I think the things to think about are, some insurance policies dictate the vendors that you use. Others, require that you notify them as soon as it happens with outside unless they have, they want you to check with them or work with outside counsel to make sure everything's privileged. And I would say the need for making sure your cyber insurance partners are involved and aware are important and critical, and they are incredibly helpful. I think the best part, though, is making sure you understand what your policy covers before you have this event. So you're not dealing with understanding coverage in the time of crisis, but rather you're doing it before it happens.
That makes total sense. Thanks, Graham. So another question, I think this was more toward David. It came in as you were talking about speed to notify, David. This question asks, is there a best practice goal to shoot for in number of days or hours?
Yeah, that's a good question there. Not really, and the reason for that is it depends on the size of the event, and so there may be regulatory dates that you need to work to, and they should always be adhered to. And then from there you start working back. Now, the reason why it depends on the size of the event as well is if you have a large event, the last thing you want to do is send out, let's call it 500,000 letters all in one go. Because if you're informing that level of people all in one go, and then there is a contact center, now whether that's an external one with a provider or whether that's the internal company's one, you are going to inundate that contact center if you do the notification in one fell swoop. So what we try and do with clients is look at the numbers, look at where the spread is of addresses or email addresses, and work out the best route to send those notifications out, so that they're going out with no undue delay, but also that we're best maximizing the use of any contact center and not from a cost efficiency perspective.
Great. I think that makes total sense. And I believe Brian spoke about investigation, right? There's also the investigation piece. Okay, so another question that came in was kind of a follow-up. Kevin asks, how quickly can Kroll mobilize and commence the notification process?
So it's a great question. The answer is immediately. We are set up and established to handle these crises all the time. This is, your crisis is our everyday. And so, like sort of a fire department, they're always ready to put out the fire. That's sort of our model. And so, obviously understanding size, scope, requirements are part of it, but we are always available and always working towards extinguishing the crisis that you're facing. And we have, our ability to scale, as David talked about earlier in the presentation, is I would say the largest from a market perspective because of our size and because of the types of cases that we handle. We have that ability to handle events as small as one or two individuals whose data have been compromised, all the way up to 500 million people around the world. So our ability to scale and our speed, I would say, are unprecedented in the market and put us in a very good place to help our clients and help them reduce their risk and take it from a level 10 to a level 2 as fast as possible.
Thank you for that. You also touched on a different question that was around limitations. If there was any limit to the number of notifications we could prepare on behalf of our clients.
So I can say that. In reality, no, there isn't a limitation. There's there would be advice in terms of, as I said before, about how many would send out in one go. But in reality, as Brian said, for events that have the tens of millions of people that we've done a number of times, that is one of the things that the client is keen to know, is like, actually, is this too much? Can you actually send out that many notifications? Can you actually deal with that number of calls? Now, if you're asking us, can we deal with 30 million calls in one day? Absolutely not. That would push anybody over the brink. But with the right planning, the right resources in place around the world, then we can absolutely deal with the largest breaches that are out there.
Great. Thank you, David. I have one last question in the chat. So this is around, okay, is there a different approach recommended for different populations, like seniors, employees, or even third-party vendors if there's a breach?
So I can take this. So the answer is absolutely. You have to know your population. So here's an example. I think we can cut it two ways. So let's take let's say you have a retiree population. The retiree population tends to, and I know this from experience, when they call into the call center, they want to talk. They're home all day, they're not at work, and they may be more upset than other parts of the population, and they're going to let you know it, and they're going to spend more time on the phone with you. So if you know that your population are retired, you probably need to think about how you're going to address it a little differently. You may want to have different call center hours. You may want to have FAQ. We may want to train the call center and work with the call center to make sure that they are addressing that population's needs. They may be a little less tech savvy from a remedy perspective. So understanding that population, that's one angle. I think another angle to touch on is language. And again, I'm going to speak it from a purely U.S. perspective for a second. If you have a client, and the bulk of the population only speaks predominantly Korean, you need to make sure that you have a mechanism for them to call in and speak to someone in their native language if that's how you communicate with them. So if you're sending them a letter and that letter's in Korean, you need to make sure that from a call center perspective, when they call in, they can speak to somebody in their language. So understanding your demographics and understanding the environment with whose data you compromised is really an important input to the process of putting a solution in place.
Got it. Thanks, Brian. That makes total sense. We have time for one last question that just came in. So what kind of reporting is typically provided during a breach notification? Like, do we show number of inbound calls, any sort of statistics on delivery, and how do we know that the letters are reaching, or the notifications are reaching the people that they should?
Yeah, I can take that one, Leo. Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one of the reasons why clients want to know this and should know this is if at all where there is potential litigation or they are under sort of questions from a regulator, I think having the data and the reporting to hand to be able to demonstrate to a regulator is really important. So I think you touched on a few there, Leo, but we would be looking to show how many letters may have been sent, where they've been sent to. We then can provide reports in terms of which ones were delivered, which ones weren't. If we're looking at things like emails, then again, some simple statistics around which ones were looked to be delivered, which ones were bounced back. There is some work that happens prior to letters going out. So you might have a data set of, let's say, 1 million people, but actually once we go through that data set may actually be reduced. And I'm still always astounded when I see some of the lines of data that are removed when you have people signing up for accounts as Mickey Mouse or the princess living at the Disney castle and things like that. Then moving on to things like call center, absolutely. Some of the things that we will always report to a client is how many calls have they had. That's really important because I think that gives you and the client a really good idea of how important this is to people. If you're seeing a large call-in rate, well, maybe that's something to pry into and understand why is there a large call-in rate. Now, sometimes we know why. So a good example will be if it's an older population, as Brian said, we may see higher call-in rates. If it is more sensitive data, then again, you may have higher calling rates for people trying to find out a bit more about it. The other point there is escalations. And so there's one thing for somebody to call up and want to know a bit more about what has gone on, or a bit more about the services that are being offered. But that is very different to somebody phoning up and saying, I'm very, very angry about this. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to start a class action. Or maybe they have a genuine reason why they need to speak to somebody. I think one of the things that a lot of individuals will want to hear is, what is my personal details that have been impacted here. And then I think lastly, if there are any monitoring solutions that have been offered, how many people have signed up for those services? Because again, that gives the client a good understanding of that breach population, how many have taken those services in order to try and give themselves a little bit of protection on the web and online to potentially mitigate any harm as a result of the breach.
Got it. That was perfect, David. Thank you. And I think this is a very nice ending to the session. We have no further questions, and we're 4 minutes out to the hour. I really want to thank everyone for joining in and participating. Brian, David, thank you for all your effort, and we'll catch back with you soon. Stay tuned for the recording coming out in a few days.